I'm a cinema usher. What happens after midnight is not in the job description. The red velvet curtains still smell like cigarettes from the 1970s, even though smoking has been banned in the Orpheum Theater for over 30 years. I know this because I spend 12 hours a day breathing in that stale, haunting aroma while guiding moviegoers to their seats with my little flashlight. My name is Marcus, and I've been working as an usher at this old downtown cinema for 8 months now. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 weeks ago, and I still can't sleep through the night. The Orpheum isn't your typical multiplex. Built in 1923, it's one of those grand old theaters with ornate ceiling moldings, crystal chandeliers that haven't been cleaned since the Clinton administration, and seats that creak like old bones when you sit down. The lobby still has its original marble floors, though they're cracked now, with weeds somehow growing through the fissures despite being indoors. The whole place feels like it's barely holding on to life, which is probably why they pay us minimum wage and don't ask too many questions during the hiring process. I took this job because I needed something that would let me work nights and study during the day. I'm a junior at the community college, majoring in film studies. Ironic, I know. My manager, Mrs. Chen, is a 70-something woman who's worked here since the theater reopened in 1987 after being abandoned for over a decade. She never talks about what happened during those empty years, but sometimes I catch her staring at Theater 3 with an expression that makes my skin crawl. The Orpheum has 5 theaters total. Theaters 1 and 2 are the main ones, seating about 200 people each. Theater 3 is smaller, maybe 80 seats, and it's where they show the art films and foreign movies that 3 people come to see. Theaters 4 and 5 are tiny screening rooms in the basement that they use for private events and film society meetings. That's where my story really begins, though I didn't know it at the time. It was a Tuesday night in October 15th to be exact. I remember because it was the night before my midterm exam in contemporary horror cinema, and I was planning to study during the quiet hours between showings. The last movie in Theater 1 ended at 11:47 p.m., and by midnight, the place was empty except for me and Jimmy, the projectionist. Jimmy's worked here longer than anyone except Mrs. Chen, and he has this nervous habit of clicking his tongue when he's uncomfortable. That night, he was clicking like a metronome. "You ever notice how Theater 3 gets cold at night?" Jimmy asked me as we were doing our closing rounds. He was right, even though the heating system was ancient and unreliable. Theater 3 always seemed to maintain a different temperature from the rest of the building. Not just cold, but cold in a way that seemed to seep into your bones and stay there. "Old buildings," I shrugged, though I'd noticed it too. "Probably just drafts." Jimmy stopped walking and looked at me with those watery blue eyes of his. "Marcus, I've been here 15 years. This ain't about drafts." Before I could ask what he meant, we heard it. A sound coming from Theater 3, the unmistakable squeak of one of those old seats folding down. Then another, like someone was walking down the row, choosing a seat, thinking better of it and moving on. "Did you lock Theater 3? Jimmy whispered. I nodded, pulling out my ring of keys to show him. Every theater gets locked after the last showing, standard procedure. But the sounds continued, accompanied now by what sounded like someone rustling through a bag of popcorn. Jimmy's tongue clicking reached a fever pitch. "We should call Mrs. Chen. At midnight, she'll think we're crazy." I was trying to sound rational, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. Probably just the building settling. These old places make all sorts of noises. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to both of us. Buildings don't settle in rhythm. Buildings don't settle with the specific sound of velvet theater seats and concession stand snacks. And buildings definitely don't settle with the faint sound of someone humming along to music that isn't playing. The humming was what made my blood turn to ice water. It was a woman's voice, low and melodic, humming what sounded like a lullaby. But there was something wrong with it, something that made the melody sound backwards, like it was being played in reverse or underwater. "We have to check," I said, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. "If someone broke in, we need to know." Jimmy shook his head so hard I thought his neck might snap. "No way, not me. I've seen what happens to people who go poking around where they shouldn't." "What do you mean, what happens to people?" But Jimmy was already backing away, his keys jingling as his hands shook. "I'm going to the projection booth to call Mrs. Chen. You do whatever you want, but I'm not going near Theater 3 tonight." He disappeared up the stairs, leaving me alone in the lobby with that humming echoing through the walls. The sound seemed to be getting louder, more insistent, and now I could swear I heard other sounds mixed in: the pop of opening soda cans, the whisper of candy wrappers, the soft murmur of conversation. It sounded like Theater 3 was full of people watching a movie. But I absolutely knew that it was empty and locked. My hands were shaking as I approached the theater doors. The brass nameplate read Theater 3 ESD, 1923 in elegant script, but someone had scratched something underneath it. In the dim light, I could barely make out what looked like dates: 1987 to 1989, and below that, "Never forget the silent audience." The doors to Theater 3 are heavy oak with frosted glass panels. As I got closer, I could see light flickering behind the glass, the blue-white glow of a movie projector. But that was impossible. Jimmy was upstairs, and he hadn't started any projectors. The last movie in Theater 3 had ended at 9:30 p.m., and I'd watched him shut everything down myself. I pressed my ear to the door, and what I heard made every hair on my body stand at attention. It wasn't just humming anymore. It was the sound of a full audience, dozens of people laughing, gasping, whispering commentary to each other. The audio was crystal clear, as if I was standing in the middle of a packed theater during a popular movie. But underneath those normal sounds, there was something else, something that made my stomach turn. The laughter was too long, stretching out beyond what any human laugh should last. The gasps came in perfect unison, like a choir of surprise. And the whispers were all saying the same thing over and over: "He's here. He's finally here. Welcome to the show." My rational mind was screaming at me to leave, to follow Jimmy upstairs and wait for Mrs. Chen. But something stronger was pulling me forward, like invisible hands guiding me toward the door. I felt like I was watching myself from outside my body as I selected the key for Theater 3 and slid it into the lock. The key turned with a click that seemed to echo through the entire building, and the sounds from inside immediately stopped. Complete, absolute silence. Even the humming cut off mid-note, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the thundering of my pulse in my ears. I pushed the door open just a crack and peered inside. Theater 3 was full. Every single seat was occupied by a perfectly still figure, all facing the screen where a black and white movie was playing with no sound. The figures looked like people. I could see the silhouettes of heads and shoulders, the occasional glint of light off eyeglasses or jewelry. But something about them was wrong. They were too still, too perfectly arranged, like mannequins positioned for a department store display. And every single one of them was turned around, looking directly at me. In the flickering light of the movie projector, I could see their faces, pale, gaunt, with dark hollows where their eyes should be. Their mouths were open in expressions of perpetual surprise or horror, and I realized with dawning terror that I recognized some of them. The woman in the third row looked like Mrs. Patterson, who used to come to the Sunday matinees before she died in a car accident last year. The man in the back corner had the same distinctive handlebar mustache as Mr. Rodriguez, the Film Society president who'd had a heart attack in this very theater 6 months ago. They were all dead. Theater 3 was full of dead people, and they were all staring at me with those empty, hungry sockets. The woman in the front row, Mrs. Patterson, slowly raised her hand and pointed at me. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Your turn." That's when I ran. I slammed the theater door behind me and sprinted across the lobby, my footsteps echoing off the cracked marble like gunshots. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely grip the banister as I hauled myself up the stairs to the projection booth, taking them 3 at a time. Behind me, I could hear the heavy oak door of Theater 3 creaking open again, followed by the soft shuffle of footsteps on carpet. They were following me. "Jimmy," I burst into the projection booth, gasping for air. "Jimmy, we need to get out of here right now." But the booth was empty. Jimmy's coffee mug was still warm on the counter, steam rising from the surface, and his jacket was draped over his chair like he'd just stepped out for a moment. The phone receiver was off the hook, dangling by its cord and emitting a steady dial tone. I grabbed the phone and frantically dialed Mrs. Chen's number, which was taped to the wall next to a dozen other emergency contacts. It rang once, twice, 3 times before her groggy voice answered. "Mrs. Chen, it's Marcus. Something's wrong at the theater. There are people in Theater 3, but they're not. They're not alive." Silence on the other end. Then, "Marcus, what did you see exactly?" "Dead people, sitting in the seats. They were all looking at me and I recognized some of them. Mrs. Patterson was there and Mr. Rodriguez and—" "Stay exactly where you are." Mrs. Chen's voice cut through my panic with surprising sharpness. "Don't go anywhere near Theater 3 and don't let anyone else in the building. I'm coming." "Where's Jimmy? He was supposed to be up here calling you." Another pause. "Jimmy left 20 minutes ago. Said he had a family emergency and couldn't finish his shift." The phone line went dead in my hand. Jimmy had abandoned me, left me alone in this place with whatever was lurking in Theater 3. I could hear them now, soft footsteps moving through the lobby below, accompanied by that same backwards humming I'd heard earlier. But now there were multiple voices, creating a discordant harmony that made my teeth ache. I locked the projection booth door and tried to calm my racing heart. The booth had windows that looked down into each theater, so I could see what was happening without having to go back downstairs. I crept to the window that showed Theater 3 and immediately wished I hadn't. The theater was still full, but now the figures were moving. Slowly, deliberately, they were standing up and filing out of their rows like patrons leaving after a movie. But their movements were wrong, too fluid, like they were floating rather than walking. And they were all converging toward the exit, toward the lobby where I would have to go to leave the building. The movie was still playing on the screen, but now I could see what it was. Black and white footage of the Orpheum Theater itself, but from decades ago when it was new and grand. I watched figures in 1920s clothing moving through the lobby, buying tickets, finding their seats. But something about the footage was disturbing. The people in the film kept looking directly at the camera, as if they knew they were being watched. And in the background, barely visible, I could see other figures, the same pale, hollow-eyed beings I'd just encountered. A new horror dawned on me as I realized what I was seeing. This wasn't just old footage. This was a record of everyone who had ever died in the Orpheum Theater, dating back nearly a century. And somehow they were all still here. My phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Welcome to our permanent audience. The show must go on." I didn't send that text to myself. My hands were shaking too badly to even hold the phone steady. But somehow, someone or something had my number. Another text. "We've been waiting for you, Marcus. Theater 3 has been so lonely." I tried calling 911, but the call wouldn't connect. No signal, even though I'd had full bars just minutes earlier. I tried the landline again, but now it was completely dead. No dial tone, nothing. That's when I heard footsteps on the stairs leading to the projection booth. Slow, measured steps, like someone taking their time because they knew their prey had nowhere to run. I pressed myself against the far wall of the booth, as far from the door as possible, and held my breath. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Then came a soft knocking, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. The same pattern repeated over and over, patient and persistent. "Marcus," the voice was Jimmy's, but something was wrong with it. It sounded hollow, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "Marcus, you can come out now. Mrs. Chen is here. Everything's going to be okay." But I knew that was a lie. Mrs. Chen couldn't have gotten here that fast, and Jimmy had supposedly left. This was something else wearing Jimmy's voice like a mask. "We just want to talk," the voice continued. "We want to welcome you properly. You're going to love being part of our audience." The doorknob began to turn slowly, even though I'd locked it. The old brass knob moved with deliberate precision, and I could hear the lock mechanism clicking open as if invisible fingers were working it from the outside. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed Jimmy's heavy metal flashlight from the counter and smashed out the projection booth window that looked down into Theater 1. Glass scattered everywhere, cutting my hands, but I barely felt the pain through my adrenaline. The drop to the theater floor was about 15 feet. I could break an ankle, but that was better than whatever was coming through that door. I climbed through the broken window frame just as the booth door swung open behind me. "Now that wasn't very polite," said Jimmy's voice, but when I glanced back, the figure in the doorway wasn't Jimmy at all. It was tall and impossibly thin, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned Usher's uniform from the 1920s. Its face was mostly shadow, but I could see the gleam of too many teeth in its smile. I jumped. The impact with the theater seats knocked the wind out of me, and I felt something in my shoulder pop, but I forced myself to keep moving. I half ran, half stumbled down the aisle toward the exit, leaving a trail of blood from my cut hands. But when I reached the lobby, I stopped dead. They were all there, waiting for me. Dozens of pale figures in clothing from different eras: 1920s flapper dresses, 1940s military uniforms, 1970s polyester suits, 1990s grunge outfits. Every person who had ever died in the Orpheum Theater, standing in perfect silence and staring at me with those hollow, hungry eyes. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward from the crowd. Up close, I could see that her face was exactly as I remembered from her funeral: peaceful, serene, but with an otherworldly pallor that made my skin crawl. "You can't leave, Marcus," she said in a voice like rustling leaves. "Once you've seen us, you're part of the show. That's how it works." "The Orpheum never really closed during those empty years," added Mr. Rodriguez, his handlebar mustache now gray and wispy. "We were always here, always watching, always waiting for new audience members to join us." The figure in the usher's uniform had somehow made it downstairs and was now standing behind me, blocking my retreat. "Every theater needs staff," it said in that voice that was definitely not Jimmy's. "And you've been such a dedicated employee. We think you'll fit right in." I looked around desperately, trying to find another exit. The front doors were blocked by the crowd of spirits, and the emergency exits led to alleys that were probably full of more of them. But then, I remembered something: the basement theaters. There was a service tunnel that connected to the old heating system, and it led to a maintenance exit on the other side of the building. "I have to get to Theater 4, I said, trying to sound calm. "If I'm going to be part of your audience, I should see all the shows." The spirits looked at each other with what might have been confusion. Mrs. Patterson tilted her head like a curious bird. "There are no shows in the basement theaters. Those rooms are different. Different how?" "That's where we keep the ones who tried to leave," said the usher. "The ones who couldn't accept their new role in our little community." My blood turned to ice, but I forced myself to smile. Well then, I should probably meet my fellow employees. I started walking toward the basement stairs, and to my surprise, the crowd of spirits parted to let me through. They seemed genuinely pleased that I was accepting my fate so readily. What they didn't know was that I had no intention of staying. The basement was even colder than Theater 3, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and something else, something sweet and rotten that made my stomach turn. The walls were lined with old movie posters from the theater's golden age, but in the dim light, the faces on the posters seemed to be moving, watching me as I passed. Theater 4 door was standing open, and inside I could see rows of empty seats facing a blank screen. But the seats weren't quite empty, there were shadows sitting in them, darker patches of air that suggested human shapes, and they were all perfectly still, like they were waiting for something. I walked past Theater 4 to the service tunnel entrance, but when I tried the handle, it was locked. Of course it was. Nothing was going to be that easy. That's when I heard footsteps on the basement stairs behind me. The entire crowd of spirits was following me down, their faces now showing expressions of growing suspicion. Mrs. Patterson was in the lead, and her peaceful expression had been replaced by something much less pleasant. "You're not really planning to stay, are you, Marcus?" she asked, her voice echoing strangely in the narrow basement corridor. I didn't answer. Instead, I did something I'd been thinking about since I first saw that old movie playing in Theater 3. I pulled out my phone and turned on the camera flash, pointing it directly at the crowd of spirits. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. In the bright white light, their faces became clearly visible for the first time. They weren't just pale, they were decaying. Decades or centuries of death had left their mark, and the flash revealed every detail of their decomposition. More importantly, the light seemed to cause them physical pain. They recoiled, covering their faces and letting out sounds like steam escaping from a radiator. I kept the flash going as I backed toward the service tunnel, using my shoulder to slam against the door. The old wood was rotten and gave way on the third impact, and I tumbled into the narrow maintenance tunnel beyond. The tunnel was barely wide enough for one person, and I had to crawl on my hands and knees through decades of accumulated dust and debris. Behind me, I could hear the spirits trying to follow, but they seemed to have trouble fitting through the narrow space. Their angry voices echoed through the tunnel, promising terrible things if I didn't come back. I crawled for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, my phone's flashlight showing me nothing but rusty pipes and cobwebs. Finally, I saw a faint light ahead the maintenance exit. I kicked the door open and tumbled out into the alley behind the theater, gasping the cold night air like a drowning man. I was free. But as I picked myself up and started running toward the street, I could hear Mrs. Chen's voice calling my name from somewhere in the darkness. "Marcus! Marcus, where are you? We need to talk." Mrs. Chen's voice was coming from the mouth of the alley, silhouetted against the orange glow of the street lights. But something about her posture was wrong. She was standing too straight for a 70-year-old woman, and her shadow seemed to stretch too far across the pavement. "There you are," she said as I stumbled toward the street. I was so worried when I got here and found the theater in such disarray. I stopped about 10 feet away from her, every instinct screaming danger. "How did you get here so fast? I just called you 20 minutes ago." Mrs. Chen smiled, but in the dim light, her teeth looked too sharp. "Time moves differently around the Orpheum, Marcus. Surely you've noticed that by now." That's when I realized the horrible truth. Mrs. Chen wasn't just the manager of a haunted theater, she was the keeper of it. The guardian who made sure the spirits stayed fed and the building stayed operational. And I had just become her biggest problem. "You saw them, didn't you?" she continued, taking a step closer. "Our permanent audience. They've been waiting so long for new company." "They're dead people," I said, backing away from her. "You're keeping dead people trapped in that theater." "Not trapped," Mrs. Chen corrected. "They're fulfilling their purpose. Every great theater needs an audience, Marcus, and the Orpheum has the most dedicated audience in the world. They never leave early, they never talk during the movies, and they never, ever stop watching. I pulled out my phone to call 911, but Mrs. Chen laughed a sound like breaking glass. "Cell phones don't work within a 3-block radius of the theater," she said. "The electromagnetic field generated by so many restless spirits tends to interfere with modern technology. Very inconvenient, but it does help maintain our privacy." I turned and ran toward the main street, but I could hear her following behind me with footsteps that seemed to cover twice the distance they should. When I glanced back, her shadow was keeping pace with me easily, even though she appeared to be walking at a leisurely pace. "You can't run from your destiny, Marcus," she called after me. "The theater has chosen you. You've seen behind the curtain, and now you belong to us." I reached the main street and kept running until I found an all-night diner 6 blocks away. The fluorescent lights and the smell of bacon grease felt like salvation after the otherworldly atmosphere of the Orpheum. I collapsed into a booth and ordered coffee, trying to process what had just happened. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, poured my coffee and studied my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost, honey." "Something like that," I muttered. "You wouldn't happen to work at that old theater, would you? The Orpheum." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Why do you ask?" "You're not the first person to come running in here in the middle of the night, looking like they've been through hell. There was a young man about 2 months ago, said he was a projectionist there. And before that, a cleaning lady. They all had the same look in their eyes, like they'd seen something that shouldn't exist. What happened to them?" The waitress's expression darkened. "They disappeared, both of them. Police said they probably left town, but their cars were still parked outside their apartments. Their families never heard from them again." My blood ran cold. "Do you remember their names?" "The projectionist was named David something. The cleaning lady was Maria Santos. Sweet woman, had 3 kids. I knew those names." David had been Jimmy's predecessor. Jimmy had told me that David had quit without notice, leaving the theater short-staffed. And Maria Santos. I'd seen her picture in the employee break room, part of a memorial wall for former employees who had moved on to other opportunities. They hadn't moved on. They'd been taken back to the theater and added to the permanent audience. I spent the next 3 hours in that diner, watching the sunrise through the windows and trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't go to the police, who would believe a story about a theater full of dead people. I couldn't go home. Mrs. Chen knew where I lived. And I couldn't just leave town, because something told me that wherever I went, the Orpheum would find me. Around 8 a.m., I decided to do the one thing that might give me answers. I went to the public library and started researching the history of the Orpheum Theater. What I found made my situation even more terrifying. The theater had been built on the site of an old cemetery, a potter's field where the city had buried indigent and unclaimed bodies in the early 1900s. When they relocated the graves to build the theater, they'd only moved the marked headstones. Hundreds of unmarked graves had been left undisturbed, buried directly beneath the theater's foundation. But that wasn't the worst part. According to newspaper archives, the theater had a pattern of mysterious deaths dating back to its opening in 1923. Patrons who suffered heart attacks during scary movies, employees who fell downstairs or were crushed by heavy equipment, audience members who simply never made it home after evening shows, their bodies found days later in the theater with no apparent cause of death. The deaths happened in clusters, separated by years of normal operation. 1923 to 1925, 7 deaths. 1934 to 1936, 12 deaths. 1948 to 1951, 15 deaths. The pattern continued right up through the 1980s, when the theater had closed for renovations. I cross-referenced the dates with the theater's management records and found the pattern. Every cluster of deaths corresponded with a change in management. Each new manager would work for several years, maintaining the theater's supernatural ecosystem until they either died or disappeared. Then there would be a gap while the theater searched for a replacement, someone who could be gradually introduced to the truth and convinced to become a willing participant in feeding the hungry dead. Mrs. Chen had been the manager since 1987. 38 years of feeding spirits, of luring employees into the theater's trap, of maintaining the delicate balance between the living and the dead. And now she was getting old. She needed a successor. She needed me. I realized with growing horror that my entire employment at the Orpheum had been orchestrated. My application hadn't been randomly selected. I'd been chosen specifically because I fit a profile. Young, isolated, studying film, which meant I'd be naturally curious about the theater's history, and desperate enough for work that I wouldn't ask too many questions. Jimmy had been my predecessor in training. He'd probably started seeing things months ago, been gradually introduced to the truth, and finally reached his breaking point when he realized what Mrs. Chen expected of him. That's why he'd abandoned me. He'd been given the same choice I was facing now, and he'd chosen to run. But according to the waitress at the diner, people who ran from the Orpheum didn't stay gone. I spent the rest of the day at the library, researching everything I could about supernatural containment and exorcism. Most of it was useless folklore and Hollywood nonsense, but I did find some interesting historical accounts of similar hauntings. There was a common thread in the successful cases. The supernatural activity was always tied to a specific object or location that served as an anchor. For the Orpheum, I suspected that anchor was the original projection equipment in Theater 3. It was the oldest piece of technology in the building, installed when the theater first opened, and it had been present for every single mysterious death over the past century. I waited until after midnight to return to the theater. Mrs. Chen's car was in the parking lot, but the building appeared to be empty. I used my key to enter through the back employee entrance, the same door I'd escaped through hours earlier. The theater felt different now, expectant, like it was holding its breath. The spirits were still there. I could sense them watching from the shadows, but they weren't actively pursuing me. It was as if they were waiting to see what I would choose. I made my way to Theater 3, where the old projector was still running, casting that eerie black and white footage onto the screen. The theater was full again, every seat occupied by those patient, hollow-eyed figures. But now I could see them clearly, and I understood something I'd missed before. They weren't malevolent. They were desperate. These weren't evil spirits trying to harm me. They were trapped souls who had been enslaved by the theater for decades or centuries. The malevolent force was something else, something that fed on their spiritual energy and used them as bait to lure new victims. Mrs. Patterson looked up at me from her front row seat and mouthed a single word: "Help." That's when I understood what I had to do. I climbed up to the projection booth and examined the old equipment. The projector was a 1923 model, all brass fittings and mechanical precision. But there was something else connected to it, a small black box covered in symbols that definitely weren't part of the original design. As I reached for the box, Mrs. Chen's voice echoed through the theater. "I wouldn't touch that if I were you, Marcus. It's been keeping this place running for over a century." She was standing in the theater entrance, but she looked different now. Older, more fragile, but also somehow more dangerous. The mask of kindly theater manager had fallen away, revealing something ancient and hungry underneath. "You have a choice to make," she continued. "You can destroy that device and release all these souls, but you'll also release something much worse. The entity that's been feeding on them will be free to find a new hunting ground. Or you can take my place as the theater's keeper, maintain the status quo, and save countless lives in other places." "There's a third option," I said, pulling out my phone. I destroy the device and then I destroy the theater. I'd spent the afternoon not just researching supernatural containment, but also learning about the city's urban development plans. The Orpheum was scheduled for demolition in 6 months to make way for a new shopping complex. If I could just hold out until then, the problem would solve itself. Mrs. Chen laughed. Do you really think we'd let that happen? Every demolition crew that's tried to touch this building has met with unfortunate accidents. The city keeps postponing the project, finding new excuses to delay. This theater will stand forever, Marcus, with or without your cooperation. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was looking at the footage still playing on the screen, and I'd finally realized what it was showing me. It wasn't just random scenes from the theater's history. It was a recording of every soul that had ever been trapped here, a supernatural database of the entity's victims. And if the footage contained their spiritual essence, then destroying the projector wouldn't just break their chains, it would erase them completely. I looked down at the audience of trapped spirits, all staring at me with desperate hope in their hollow eyes. Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly, understanding what I'd realized. They would rather be destroyed than continue this eternal imprisonment. I'm sorry, I whispered, and I smashed the black box with Jimmy's heavy flashlight. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The projector exploded in a shower of sparks and twisted metal, and every light in the theater went out. In the darkness, I heard the most beautiful sound I'd ever experienced, dozens of voices sighing in relief as they were finally released from their century-long captivity. But then I heard something else, a roar of pure rage that seemed to come from the walls themselves, followed by the sound of the building beginning to collapse. I ran through the darkness as chunks of plaster and timber crashed around me. Behind me, I could hear Mrs. Chen screaming, but her voice was changing, becoming something inhuman and ancient. The entity that had been hiding behind her facade was finally revealing itself, and it was not happy about losing its food source. I made it to the employee exit just as the ceiling of the lobby caved in. The entire building was shaking itself apart, as if the supernatural forces that had held it together for so long were finally letting go. I stood in the parking lot and watched the Orpheum Theater collapse in on itself like a house of cards. When the dust settled, there was nothing left but a pile of rubble and twisted metal. No sign that there had ever been a building there at all. The next morning, the local news reported that the old theater had finally been demolished to make way for the new shopping complex. City officials claimed they'd moved up the timeline due to structural concerns, and no one seemed to remember that there should have been a demolition crew involved. I never found out what happened to Mrs. Chen. The official story was that she'd been relocated to a nursing home in another state, but I suspect the truth was much simpler. When the entity lost its anchor to our world, it probably took her with it. I quit my job at the community college and moved to a different city, as far from the Orpheum as I could get. I work day shifts now, in a modern office building with fluorescent lights and no history of mysterious deaths. But sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear that backwards humming. And sometimes I wonder if I really destroyed that entity, or if I just forced it to find a new hunting ground. Last week, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, there was only silence on the other end, followed by the faint sound of someone clicking their tongue. Click, 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 like a nervous projectionist trying to calm his nerves. I'm thinking about changing my phone number, maybe moving again. Because I have a terrible feeling that Jimmy didn't escape after all, and that somehow the show must go on.